Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our weekly Wednesday webinar. Today we're here for a conversation with Howard Collins OBE. My name is Emma Woods and I'm the Director of Corporate Affairs with the Australasian Railway Association, and I'm going to be facilitating the conversation today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people. They are the traditional landowners of where I'm located today here in Canberra at the ARA office. For those of you who have joined us for some of our webinars before, you'll know that we really try to make these as interactive as possible. And so we really encourage you to ask questions. You have the ability to select the question tab on your screen and submit as many questions as you like. We will ask these of Howard at the end of our session. He said he's going to try to provide as much time as possible so that we can really have quite an actual conversation and a bit of a discussion today around what he's working on. So Howard, many of you will be aware of or may have heard of. He's a bit of a living legend in our rail industry, both here in Australia and of course in the UK. Howard's worked for Transport for New South Wales for the last 7 years, the majority of which he was the CEO of Sydney Trains. And in the last 6 months, he's taken on a new role with Transport for New South Wales, where he is the COO of Greater Sydney. Prior to that, he was the COO of the London Underground. And so he led their network over there. But today he's here to have a chat with you, share his insights and his knowledge and his wealth of experience. He's going to talk to us today about what his new role entails and the fact that he's branched out of rail and is now taking on a multimodal challenge. He's going to talk to us about how Transport for New South Wales has approached the evolving COVID situation and where the future of transport is going in New South Wales. So without further ado, I welcome Howard to our screens and I encourage you to throw in your questions as they arise. Thanks for joining us, Howard.
Thank you very much indeed, Emma, and I'm delighted to be here. I'm sitting on the 44th floor at 680 George Street, and you can see there's a few maps behind me. But the first thing I'd like to say, and like Emma, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. And I also acknowledge the fact that wherever you are, that apparently hundreds of people are out there, on the lands that you're sitting on at the moment and working today, and acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in that meeting. It's great to have you on board. I do pay my respects genuinely to the elders past and those present and those emerging in our industry, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and then their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters wherever you are. Thank you. I also, as a sort of reminder, and just very briefly, yesterday was an important time for me and one or two of my colleagues, as it was the 15th anniversary of the London bombings, and it was 7/7. And we exchanged a few emails or texts between Mike Brown, Nigel Holness, a few others, to say we'll never forget the 52 lives which were lost on that day, and my experience of that time will never be forgotten. But there's always, out of tragedy and adversity comes opportunity, and I think it reminded me, even with the ongoing COVID situation, is what, sometimes in this industry we're at our best when we're pushed, when things are really tough. And I think that's something to reflect on our culture, not only in the past and my 5 decades of work, which is really scary in itself, but also about the future and what the future holds. Now, hey, it's a bit of a conversation. I could talk not only for England but Australia, so I'm going to ensure that my colleagues keep me to time. So a 30-minute sort of chat and tell you where I am and what's happening, and share some of my experiences from the immediacy of right now and the experiences of border force, as I like to think about we're talking about at the moment, but also about the future of rail and our industry in Australia and New Zealand, and my role as the as a director of ARA. So I have been here in this wonderful country of Australia for over 7 years now. And yes, most of that time, from fixing the trains to a customer-centric environment, I've been the chief executive of Sydney Trains, and for actually a couple of years, Trainlink as well. But a true railway man, over 40 years experience, a bit of dabbling with those rubber-tired things called buses. How did I get tempted out of my steel rail culture into something which sounds very different? I think I understood the compelling argument about the fact that our customers, whether that's a lump of coal sitting in a mine to a person who wants to travel, it's not just about rail. And the experience I've had over the last 5 months has really been about how I'm understanding how this all gets connected in the world of transport, whether that's public transport, whether that's freight, or even the world of our waterways. So I'm in this role, I'm secondment, the Chief Operating Officer for Transport for New South Wales, Greater Sydney. And I suppose the first thing I ought to explain for those who don't quite understand is Transport for New South Wales. It is what it is on the tin. It's everything to do with transport in the state of New South Wales. But what's Greater Sydney? And I've heard this thing called regional and outer metropolitan. What does that mean? Well, what has happened is, and quite rightly, I think, a lot of our thinking in the past was very Sydney-centric. I'm sure Pete Allaway would say very much biased towards, the 4 or 5 million people who live in an 8 million population state. So getting the balance between the regional setting and the importance of regional support, generation and growth, and also still working on what we call Greater Sydney, it was important to recognise that there are 2 areas of significance from a customer's point of view, and that's the regions, those big cities, Newcastle, Wollongong, Blue Mountains boundary, but beyond that, in a huge state. I remind my UK friends that we can fit the UK 7 times in our state, and I'm sure in others probably even greater if you look at Western Australia. But that's how we're set up, and we've got a Deputy Secretary for Outer Metropolitan and Regional, Caroline Nelson, and Elizabeth Marwater, who's the Deputy Secretary. I look after Greater Sydney. In the operational contents, that's everything. So yes, under my wing certainly is the existing rail network, Sydney Trains, but I'm beginning to understand and learn about, and you've probably seen behind, and let me do the list, because otherwise I might forget. Well, it's a bit like having a lot of kids in your family. It's terrible when you forget someone. So let me tell you about the fact that not only the traditional train operation that we have within Sydney Trains, and working closely with my colleagues in Metro, but also the State Transit Authority is really important. That's the existing bus networks within North and Eastern Sydney. But on top of that, I've got all the bus contracts in Greater Sydney. Light rail, I'm learning a lot about light rail, and I know in ARA that's a growing and significant area of our business. Ferries and the contracted ferry services that we have. And then across the state, I've even got the responsibility for maritime. And then would you believe it, I find I'm doing other things as well, like road maintenance, like even the responsibility for the Harbour Bridge. And if I just try and bring to life some of the existing fun things I'm discovering, big orange trucks which tow these great big trucks which break down off of various roads, maritime safety boating officers, it's an exciting experience, and certainly even in my career, I would recommend anyone who, even if they think, oh, I've seen it and done it all, there's nothing better than doing something different and you learn a lot more. So there's a lot of stuff out there. And what I've discovered, it is about end-to-end management of that information real time. I was been involved last weekend in opening what's called a very Australian name, the M8, or MATE as some people call it. I think that was quite exciting because it's part of a jigsaw of joining up, not only just for car drivers like me, but also giving the opportunity to keep freight moving. And freight is one of those areas I recognise, and not just about rail freight. Often companies are operating in that road and rail freight mode. It's also about being multimodal and a one-stop from a customer point of view, information. And as I've found, we can do a splendid job in Sydney trains, but if outside of the station, the interchange is looking pretty grotty because it's either the council's responsibility or someone else's responsibility, it's no good because that customer experience will be that memorable moment of feeling pretty unsafe in an interchange location. Hence why we've got to look at these things in a broader context. So that's really what we're doing. It's coordinating not only the day of operations, but looking forward and saying, what do we need to ensure happens when we've got events happening or new construction happening in our cities or towns? How do we coordinate that in one place? So not only have I got the Rail Operations Centre, that sexy new building, which I'm sure a few of you have seen, which is all bells and whistles and looks fantastic, but also the Transport Management Centre, and also the job of bringing things all together in one place. The other role, and maybe it's because, as they say, I'm the face of radio, I also have a responsibility for Transport New South Wales, acting as a bit of their spokesperson. So if you want to turn the TV off on a regular basis, if you're watching 7 and 9, please do so if I appear. I now was talking about from Opal fares to motorway opening to rail delays, but I think it's fascinating that you get a better perspective and you can talk more effectively about the whole picture when you have that sort of overall responsibility. So 5 months into it, what does it feel like as someone who's come from rail? Well, how do you really make this happen more quickly than perhaps a year of developing the organisation? Well, you have a good crisis. That's what generally helps cement organisational structure. And in February, when I first thought about that, and I was looking at, a few cases of COVID happening and China going through it, but would we ever be affected? Now, if you look at it, it's a very different world, and for us particularly, and I'd like to describe a little bit about what Transport's reaction was to and what we did in terms of COVID, and our response was no one would have believed that the impact it's had. And even if I reflect on last week, we have now seen another change and opportunity in the last few days, which could go either way. And I think, my first thing I'd say is, we all offer our support for those people in Melbourne, particularly in Victoria. I think it's not constructed if we see this territorial behaviour about we're okay, sod the other state. I think we, as a rail industry particularly, should be respectful, mindful, and work together with our colleagues wherever they are, whether they're doing well or whether there's a challenge ahead. So COVID, as Mr. Trump said, it'll all be over by Easter, and how accurate that guy is. I would say the interesting thing about this is the acceleration of our standing up to deal with this was and has been something which has helped me and my team in COO really form up pretty quickly, because we had to cover not only all modes and make sure we were pretty damn quick at dealing with that, but also for the whole of state. But more importantly, and thanks to ARA, having conversations with Nick Easy, Jerome Weimar, and other people around our borders to understand what this means for us in the rail industry. And thanks to everyone who's really been very open and sharing what we're doing, because it is very important. So the essence of what happened to us was, I believe, our big boss, Rod Staples, really felt that we needed to stand up a specific and dedicated Transport for New South Wales task force, selecting those people who were good at managing that crisis management to deliver our first response. And Mark Hutchins, who's normally my head of maritime, but a 39.5-year police veteran, and a sidekick of his and very, very experienced Karen McCarthy, ex-police officer, but now within Sydney Trains. They were the two components, along with a lot of supporting people with legal and commercial and IR, setting up this task force. A dedicated team, locked into a dedicated location, a secret bunker located very near the Sydney Harbour Bridge, but certainly a dedicated location, which wasn't part of our BAU. And what were we facing? Just remind ourselves. We were facing this question about two things. Would we have to shut down our services because we ran out of staff because everyone was going sick? Was this emerging daily increase of cases and deaths which were starting to appear? Were we going to see the same impact that we had seen tragically across Italy, Spain, UK, and then, as it emerged across the world? And we were really on that back foot approach to saying, how many cases we got today? Anyone in our bus drivers, train drivers who have contaminated or caught this terrible disease? And that's what we're looking at. But I think very soon, probably I would say, and this is a personal view, due to a bit of a shockwave of what happened with the Ruby Princess, people understood that what we had to do was to do something pretty dramatic in terms of how we operated our services, which was continue on, providing we had the workforce, continue on with what we said we would do, all services, all times, and agree with our contracted services, we would do that. Engage with, obviously, our colleague trade unions and make sure they understood what the risks were. We had the great advantage of having our own chief medical officer within transport, actually within my old area, Sydney Trains, and I hung on to that role because I recognised it was important having a professional medical practitioner within the rail industry, which gave, Dr. Arman Castellin gave us some great advice and actually managed to steer off a lot of hearsay and rumour by acting as that informed professional. So once we got past that point, we realised that people actually were coming to work on an even more regular basis than they would do normally. Our attendance levels have never been as high as this period. We realised that what we had to do was manage a couple of things. The first thing we fell into, but did a remarkable job, is when airports got into international travel into hotels, there was a lot of speculation of, well, how are we going to do that? So we stepped up. We grabbed, first the STA did a marvellous job, State Transit Authority, providing that first 2 days of lockdown busing from, with the army herding the people in to buses and then off to hotels, and then quickly established through our coaching industry experience the moving of people, of which we have now moved 21 to 22,000 international arrivals, returnees to Australia, into hotels within Sydney. And we certainly are now in a place where we feel pretty proud of not only the logistics of that, but also how we've worked with New South Wales Police, the ADF and the Federal Police in ensuring this is a pretty robust process from get-go to where we park the things at Sydney Airport, to the logistics, to our transport commanders. But not only were we doing that, we're also managing the fact that fairly soon after that, we had to apply restrictions across bus, light rail, and many other things. Now, you've been there before, but what we discovered was we had to really deal with trying to change people's behaviour. Travel demand management, you've heard it before, trying to talk to people about essential travel only, managing people's expectations. In the height of it, we were down to 20 to 25% of travel. Since then, we've seen the gradual 3 to 4% per week increase. And we got to a situation where a lot of our services were getting full and over the 25% limit by 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the morning. So what we do, we loaded more services, 4,000 extra services, mainly in buses, squeezed a few more trains on the peak hour network, got a few more ferries running, and really tried to ensure that we helped our freight friends in rail with some more pathing and some more space, because we recognised that we weren't carrying the numbers of customers, and we could make some adjustments to give freight a good go at continuing on with their essential provision. We got to a stage though where we needed to make the next step, and I've got one for you here just in case. You know, the green dot. I used to dream about these things. 455,000, I think, dots. Yeah, and you may have seen the photographs. They're stuck on electrical pylons. I'm sure there's one almost, if the borders are open, they'd be stuck on Mount Everest and other places around the world. But they did provide a bit of confidence and guidance, and we felt we needed to do that. Tell people how many people can get on the buses. Tell people how many people can load on each train carriage. And we've increased that now to about a 50% loading from the 1st July. And we see that as a step in the right direction. It might have been overkill. People say to me, Howard, you just need to get some common sense here. But I think in this state, you know, we felt we had to sort of really drive people's behaviours and make it so blindly obvious, a green dot hit you between the eyes so that you knew what to do. And yeah, some people didn't heed to it, but generally speaking, it was there for a reason. To make this work, we knew there was no power of our staff. We didn't want our staff to be the victims of people getting a bit stroppy about this. So we worked with the Police Transport Command, but more importantly, we took on the role of marshalling, and we used our transport officers who normally check tickets, along with private security companies who had plenty of time on their hands because they weren't patrolling schools or airports. And we've worked a marshalling concept, which again, I think has worked really well in terms of patrolling and checking people around. So that's COVID. We have settled that down, and then suddenly border control happens. And being conscious of my watch, I'm 20 minutes into this, I would say it's a new story emerging in itself. And we worked pretty well with Queensland, and we understood the routine and how we could manage the roads and the interface and even the XPT services. Now we are in a position where I put my hand up and say, Pete Alloway and Carol Nelson are doing an amazing job dealing with the challenge of a border which is not a border, which is from start of this morning, an area where we're checking people into the state. And yeah, there have been some challenges. You've seen the media. The media always loves things going wrong. They don't talk about all the effort that everyone has made, in particular in transport, understanding that. And it's not just about trucks and cars. It is understanding how we can have the smooth 25 trains a day of one operator alone crossing the border between Victoria and New South Wales, and working with our colleagues in our RTC and many other operations. Here's a quirky one though, the Murray River. I've got boating officers who patrol that, and apparently the boundary is, if you step off the land and into the water on the Victorian side, that's the boundary. So as soon as you're floating around on that Murray River, that's New South Wales. So again, lots of people picking up the challenge of that in the media last night. You know, if you're going for a recreational boating experience of Victorian, you're technically, once you untie your boat and head out in the Murray River, you're in New South Wales. So lots of things still to be dealt with, and we're even debating how that gets managed even now, but that's a challenge. So COVID, what it's done for me and certainly for transport, is brought us together, made us think about multimodal. You know, when we're dealing with these, it was saying, yeah, trains, light rail, how's it done on buses? How do we post them or get them to the 120 private operators, the mum and dad and baby son or daughter operators in regional New South Wales? You're going to have to rely on a courier or Auspost to get to a little bus shack with 4 buses in it somewhere in rural and regional New South Wales. That's the challenge we faced on one particular subject. So I want to move on from COVID now, because a lot have said, I'm sure there are lots of other people who've been talking about that, and certainly ask any questions you like in the Q&A and the chat session. But I want to really now move on to say, well, we've done a few things to see whether we can change the travel demand management. We've made some pretty brave steps in widening the peak fares, changing the way we operate on Sundays to try and stop a crazy situation for less than the price of a cappuccino. You can have all-day travel for $2.80 on the whole network. You can go from Maitland to Goulburn for $2.80. You can spend all day on the ferries. We've changed that. It's now $8.05 Saturday and Sunday. We put a 50% discount on rail fares, but really widened the peak so that there's been a lot of negativity about, well, this is really government rorting it. I don't think it's that. I think it's us trying to see whether we can change demand. The one question I'd ask all of you is, do we really want to go back to putting everything we can on rail into that peak 2 hour? We cram in a train every 3 minutes. Metro says that they can do a train every 4 minutes. Well, on the heavy rail network, we do every 3 minutes on most of our rail corridors. And it just about gets there. And when we are crowded with 1.5 million customers in Sydney, the timetable doesn't really run that well, because every second of delay causes rail delays and the timetable runs late. What we're discovering, with even half the number of people travelling, and the ability for us to catch up time with a bit more space in the dwell time management, because less people are trying to get on and off, we can run 100% and 99%. And even when we get a big delay, we can recover quickly. So there may be some work we need to do across even Australia and New Zealand to say, do we run more services on a flatter peak and encourage people really not to try and get into the 9 to 5 routine? We all thought that was a pretty crummy movie somewhere in the past, but still people, when you look at it, were trying pre-COVID to squeeze themselves onto our trains nose to nose. We've got to change that. And I welcome some thoughts about that from any one of you to say, how do we change that? And maybe running 16 trains an hour through our rail corridors for most of the day will encourage people to have a better, more comfortable and post-COVID experience, which might help our situation. I think the other thing I'd like to talk about is the technology and thinking widely out the box in terms of how this industry works. We have some great information about our customers on our networks, from bus loading to real-time data. We can certainly see this happening real time on trains, and this for me, I'd imagine I'll be sitting in my armchair, maybe back in my home, and I can track every bus and train around the whole Greater Sydney and where they're going and how many people are on it, and even the driver's name and where the emergency vehicles are. You can see it. It's almost a James Bond style approach to life. But in reality, some of our newest technology has the least information about it. And this is where we've been in a little bit of a silo. And I'm really keen to say, how do we become mode agnostic, but give the customer everything we want? And how do we really, really do that in terms of the customer experience so that they can make informed decisions? When sometimes I drive my car and it gives me an alternative route because there's a bit of a snarl up on this road, I like to think in the world of public transport and even in freight that we could give that information to our customers so it tells them which is the best mode. Even if it might feel a bit strange to jump on a bus because the trains are slowing up, it should be a better journey for our customers. And moving into technology even further, we often hear about, metrification, metros. I love metros. I've come from a tube environment, and to see the metro operating in Sydney and what's going to happen in Melbourne is fantastic. But it's not the only one size solution. One thing I think we in the whole of Australia, and certainly I saw first in Auckland, was to understand the open platform, open technology of digital signalling and often called the European train control system, because for me, this opens up the doors of allowing us to almost operate in a metro context, automated trains, all the reliability and performance issues, removing all that kit which people have to get on the track to fix, doing all the things about optimizing the traffic control systems and allowing our controllers to have a more hands-off experience. I think that is something we as an industry have got to embrace. And more trains, more services, and the start here in Sydney is a way of doing that. The first few $100 million have been agreed to do the physical things, the substations, the sidings and the tracks. Then we'll get into procuring the systems for the airport line and for the Illawarra line. And if everyone tells you, why do you need to do this, Howard? It's going to take 20 years for passengers to come back on the railway. Absolute rubbish. Public transport, post-COVID at some stage, is going to be even more essential for us to travel around, rather than being in steel boxes jamming up the roadways, which obviously people feel more comfortable on today. So that's sort of digital. And if I finally finish up really for this half hour before I'm going to sort of hand over to some Q&A, is I want to sort of explain my personal view about high-speed rail. And those of you who have been around longer than I have in ARA and beyond that, the romantic ideas of, European TGV, ICE Germany, or even Japanese high-speed lines shooting across Australia at 300, 400 kilometers an hour. In my early days, there were a lot of people saying, we can do it, it's all possible. One day that will happen. But in the meantime, with our feet firmly on the world of reality, the tyranny of distance, but also of volume, I think there is a really important stage approach to this. And one of the things I say is, can we have slightly faster rail first? I don't know if my experience in Sydney is any reflection of perhaps experience in Melbourne, Auckland, or even Perth, is that we creep around a bit at the end of the day. Our average run time for a journey of something like 33 kilometres or 33.6 kilometres from my home into town is a walk factor's 47 minutes if we really push it hard. When I think about 37-minute journey on a standard railway across most other countries who've embraced new technology, you could probably do 150 kilometres. Now I know we've got big hills. We're surrounded by mountains, and if you follow the line going down to Wollongong or going up to Newcastle, you can see why. We still follow the goat tracks of our sort of animals and predecessors and the walkways, rather than when we look out the window and we see 4 or 5 different versions of the Pacific Highway. But there is a first stage. That's not so much about tilting trains or fancy sort of formats. That's about straightening out some of the curves, getting rid of these slow speed crossings, looking at our track and doing something in a progressive way. And look at what other jurisdictions have done, where minute by minute, 10 minute by 10 minute, and sometimes hour by hour, they have over 10 years reduced journey times. And that is possible. And I know some states, and us as well, are looking at that, whether they call it faster rail rather than slightly faster rail. And there is, in the progression, a journey along that way where you build more dedicated rail corridors, maybe even alongside roads in the future like Perth have done, to get the legs of our trains really running. A Waratah is a great train, and more are coming off the boat as I speak. But it's a bit like a thoroughbred shackled to a slow speed because it's got to trundle around. And I think even more so our fantastic new inner city trains, which are the NIF new inner city fleet, really do need to stretch their legs if we are going to get those intercity commuters into town and other locations. So I think we all have a responsibility to take ourselves on this journey. Yes, one day we'll have fantastic touring trains. We may even see, you know, Melbourne to Sydney in less than 11 hours or whatever it takes today, and we might see Canberra connected. But let's be realistic about, you think Tokyo has more people in it than the whole of Australia, and that's just one city in Japan. We've got to understand what this means for rapid transit and mass travel. But things change. And if you look at people flying around in aluminium and Kevlar tubes in the past, you might say, well, that's the way of the future. But who knows? In the future, it may be something which involves more about rail. And the final thing I'd really like to say, but I'm going to finish, is let us not forget our freight colleagues, who may be the Cinderella of rail in some respects. I think we've got to apply some of that thinking of the future of rail to our colleagues in freight. I'm pretty impressed by what's happening out at Moorebank and the automation. I'm pretty impressed what I've seen in many of the others in Pacific National in terms of their future thinking. But we've got to apply this. Who would imagine that from Port Botany into something like a terminal, intermodal terminal, we could completely automate that and make it a seamless journey, rather than automate at each end and then trundle around on a track with a very conventional thing. It's not a steam engine anymore, but it's a diesel-driven train. There are opportunities for us. And for freight, I do think we have to get rid of some of those massive trains which run around the road network, which really do lend us to say, what more can we do for rail freight? And I'm really a big advocate that, even in my new role, to support the opportunity of rail and the freight industry. So I think, Emma, I've probably exhausted my thinking on this, and I'm just looking on my wall to say, yeah, I think I've covered most aspects. It's 37 minutes since I started. We wanted to allow enough time, didn't we? And I agreed that I'd keep an eye on the watch. So an opportunity to get some feedback. Now, the two people who are watching this, please let me know. No, hopefully it's more than that. I would say, you know what, the important thing about this industry, and Bob stole my phrase, you know, it is the golden era. Despite what's happened recently, we have got a real opportunity here. Just look at the billions of dollars being invested. So let's get on to the questions. Let's listen to what people have to say and prove me wrong. You know, you might say, Howard, you're completely barking mad. But there we are. I'm not the first person who said that. Em, what have we got? Anyone got any questions they want to ask us or share some thoughts?
Yes. No, look, we've had a bunch of questions come through, so I'm going to do my best to manage them in some sort of sensible order. So we might start with where we sort of finished off and on the freight sort of space. And the questions that has come in is, with the Victorian border road freight delays, can Sydney cope with a fast mode change to increased rail freight between Melbourne and Sydney in the next few weeks?
Yes, I think that's certainly something front of mind is, you know, we know how we manage the freight borders from a rail point of view in Queensland, and certainly talking to industry, we want to make that as really as controlled as possible, that we can identify, obviously with our freight colleagues, those people who are crossing the border, but are managed and controlled in a very sensible way. It's a bit like airline pilots, I think, at the end of the day. And I think there could be an opportunity. We're hoping, first thing this morning, we thought we could push all the trucks down the Hume and make all the cars come in. I think it's called the Lincoln Causeway. I have been to Albury and Wodonga on my old vintage motorcycle, so I know what it's like. But what happened this morning was the volume was so great. In the end, feedback from my colleagues in Transport for New South Wales Regional are saying it's all really in one queue. And I can't tell you where we are now because I've not been watching it, but I think we hopefully will get freight trucks through a seamless border with a few checks, a bit like we sometimes do with pulling in vehicles for weight checks. but we don't want to hold up the freight industry, because I know from looking out over the airport here, the most important thing is getting those freighters in by air. And we know the same, that a lot of our stuff is cross-border freight at the end of the day. But is there anything we can do? I know ARTC are probably the first call point for that. But in terms of Sydney, anything more we can do to get more freight around the rail network and provide, 50 trucks, 100 trucks equivalent with one train, let's go for it. So please feel free to contact my freight colleagues or talk through some of this with transport in the freight industry.
And just expanding on that a little bit further, you mentioned the increased pathways being allocated to freight operators, during the height of COVID to increase the freight capacity of the network. How do you see that working into the future?
Well, this is a dilemma for us, because on one hand, everyone knows that we can't handle both freight and passenger volumes during the peaks, and we've had what we call the curfew. And there are some requirements, contractual requirements, that we have to provide certain paths for freight. I think that is worth further discussion. It doesn't mean to say I'm going to go crazy and hold all the passenger trains to let the coal trains come through or whatever it is, but I do think it is under these times, when we look at what the demands are, and I talked about the opportunity, but I would say I can hear my Sydney Trains colleagues saying, yes, Howard, but make sure those trains don't cause mayhem when they break down. And I'd say to my freight colleagues, it's time. Not so much the big boys and girls of town, because they are renewing and spending billions, but can we afford to run some of our freight trains with the smell of an oily rag and an old 60-year-old train? Is it time that we actually ensured we gave reliability? You know what? If no freight trains break down ever again, I'd welcome more onto the network. But if they still have a bit of a problematic challenge up some of our hills or down some of our hills, that's why I get a bit nervous, and certainly my rail colleagues do.
That sort of leads into probably one final freight question before we look to others. But the question is, are there other projects or funding priorities in the freight space that you'd like to see that might, I guess, address that issue?
Well, even in my home ground in Port Botany, we know there are now, I think we've got a focused plan on duplication. That's been hanging around for 20 years. But I do think investment in technology, particularly on some of those corridors that either we lease or share with our colleagues in ARTC. And certainly we have seen some real focus in rural New South Wales, regional New South Wales, of seeing whether we can open up again some of those sad looking sidings where could there be better logistics. You've only got to look at Dubbo to see how that transformed into the accessibility, Mildura and many other places. So I'm keen to say, what else can we do? And it is that end-to-end journey. How do we provide seamless interface between heavy freight and then moving forward? We're even exploring an opportunity. Who would have thought we might even resurrect, trains carrying little parcels? And Howard's definitely lost a plot after the failure of the UK Red Star parcels and even New South Wales parcel vans. Those of you remember those things. But in today's world, it's all about little white vans and parcels. Maybe there's a little space within our rail business to handle some of that. We chuck them off as we go around the circle line, people pick up. Who knows? Think laterally.
We've got to try new ways of doing things. That sort of leads into the whole speed conversation and faster and high speed rail. One of the comments specific to high speed has been they regularly hear the issue of volume being raised in relation to high speed that you sort of mentioned, but we also hear that Sydney to Melbourne air route pre-COVID was the second busiest in the world. So the question is it more of a political issue than a will to speed?
I would say if you stood in Melbourne or Sydney airport, it was like catching a bus, wasn't it? If you couldn't get one, you got one in another 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour. And it felt like that. And there were obviously 2 or 3 major players in that. But has that changed now? And I know we were starting to see companies coming back into the market until last week. But I do think this might have reset the scale and understanding. I think I'm realistic that you know, having a train every half an hour zooming off to Melbourne in 6 hours is not going to be around in my lifetime. And I've told people I'm going to live to the 2056 strategy because I want to see that off as an employee. I'll be 97, by the way. But I do think we've got this interim phase where, you know, what I see is straight bits of track all around our state and maybe others, where you're bouncing along at a, you know, a walk factor 130 kilometres an hour, hanging on for dear life. If we did something about the rail infrastructure, the per way, really did something about it, we could even wind up those old XPTs to well over their, you know, terminal speed. And you know what? The fastest place those XPTs goes is actually on our Sydney Trains network in the St Mary's area, because we can open them up to even 140 kilometres an hour or 150, and it's pretty smooth because my colleagues have done a great job. I think that's where we should start. And some of these points and crossings, I say, you know, we have to slow down over some of these because, you know, otherwise the driver loses his cup of tea or the people in the back of the train suffer a, you know, whiplash. We do need to do something about that. And I know it's a big long track, and we haven't given ARTC enough money to really do a really fantastic job. It's about time government did something about that. But hey, I'm not getting too political here. Let's get some smooth tracks out there.
And I mean, that certainly aligns with the ARA policy in this space about investing in what we've got so we can bring it up to speed, identifying the new opportunities out there, build that at a fast speed, and of course, you know, high speed as a visionary sort of long-term solution.
If you want to look at a case study, Chiltern Railways, London to Oxford, was a terrible bumpy journey, equivalent to probably some of our experiences. They did a pretty amazing job, Network Rail, eating away with an operator who was keen to improve journey times, London to Oxford, for obvious reasons. That's a great example. And it wasn't billions and billions of pounds. It was millions of pounds over a period of time.
A similar experience in Ireland, and coming to your point about incremental investments and making the funding sizes, you know, more bite-sized options.
Yeah, I can remember taking a train to Ireland from Dublin. I wasn't sure when ever I would get to Tipperary, but we did get there eventually. But that was in the bad old days.
I believe it's much faster now.
Yeah.
If we sort of jump to another space, the question that's come in is the National Rail Action Plan is examining interoperability challenges and opportunities. How confident are you that we won't have a future break of gauge with the different signalling and communication systems across the standard gauge network in Australia?
That's an excellent question, because it does remind us that there's a plaque on the wall on platform 1 at Central which says the first time you could travel in Perth on one gauge was in 1970, not 1870, 1970. So we mustn't get into the technological equivalent of a break of gauge. And I would say we must consider all types of function, because I'm sure my freight colleague would say they don't want to have 15 different fangled bits of kit, it's bad enough with radio, in their trains to deal with the whole different state opportunities. European train control systems was really designed to deal with the fact that many trains traveled across a dozen different jurisdictions. And now you'll see a train leave China and get to Manchester, all by rail, and there are probably less signalling systems than we could possibly invent between Melbourne and Sydney. And that's a pretty big journey, even in Australian terms. So what should we do is, let's not go down the road of buying a bespoke system, which is great for freight because a train comes every half an hour. Let's not just wed ourselves to one manufacturer because we get locked in like a CBT system in Metro. We really do need to say all parties are welcome and we can work together in understanding how that works. And that's our philosophy in Sydney Trains and New South Wales Transport, is to try and ensure that whatever we procure and buy, maybe even the trains leaving Victoria and certainly our colleagues in Queensland, we are sharing an open platform. It's probably the equivalent of Android versus iPhone, or even an Apple Mac versus, a base PC. We do need to make sure that we don't end up with Betamax, VHS, Hi8, and all those other things that existed in our time. Probably not in yours, Emma, but certainly we've got to keep an open mind, and that's so important. And sometimes we have to admit that maybe someone else has got a better product and doing the right thing, rather than saying, we know best in New South Wales, all those other states and territories don't know what they're talking about. Sometimes it's best to be following the bleeding edge rather than being at it.
And so just building on that a little bit further, one of the questions we've had come in from one of our rail suppliers is, from a technology perspective, what is the strategic direction for Transport for New South Wales, and therefore where should rail suppliers be focusing their investments to support rail into the future?
Another good question, and certainly our strategic direction is, as I've said, open digital systems. But I turn it the other way and say, as a supply industry, would there be a real advantage for us to be listening to what the industry is saying and saying, we are working together to create a standard which is interoperable for everyone, rather than trying to sell us something dirt cheap and then tying us up in knots with a maintenance contract or a software update, which means you really are going down a path which is, isolating systems. That's what we want the industry to do, and we're willing, certainly I know, as the ARA, to embrace that as well. But it's a two-way street. We have seen some of the big suppliers in the world working more collaborative together rather than saying, we'll have this special product. And I think at the end of the day, even if you've got a Samsung and an iPhone, there are many products which work the same in that environment. And I think it's almost the same in our industry. You might have a manufactured product in New South Wales and a different one in Victoria, but they work together.
When we spoke before we kicked off this morning, you said that this is your second day in the office and you're, like many others, doing flexible work. You also spoke in your presentation about the need to sort of attract people back and rebuild that trust. The question that we've received is, how will changes with more people working from home impact future investments and expansions into public transport in future?
Yes, that's a great question. Maybe 30 years ago, someone said to me, home working, Howard, we won't need public transport. We're all going to be in a little helicopters or whatever it was, sort of in the world of 30 years ago. And I think this though is a new normal. In some ways, it's a bit of relief for me to take a little bit of a breath and say, the challenge I described, and you've probably heard me repeating this so many times, is that I felt we were trying to do open heart surgery while running a marathon, that more and more people were turning up. We gained 38% increase in volume. We've done some huge timetable changes to try and cope. The same in Melbourne, I saw in many other jurisdictions. So we were getting overwhelmed. And maybe this has given us a little of a respite to say, yeah, 50%, no big deal. It's still 1 million people a day using public transport. And the roads are as full as they were pre-COVID, by the way, if people look at it. But I do think I'm going to work differently. Personally, for me, the value I found of not, getting up at 4 and something in the morning for the last 40 years and going into work, but actually saying some of that time I can spend at home or can just go down the road to a local station or a hub and meet people there or have a different experience is important. But I think there will be less probably formal travel, and what happens in the CBD will be interesting, because big businesses are telling us already that they're not going to be full in the next year, 2 years, or even 5 years. But I do think the other thing is people still will wish to travel. And I don't think we're going to go back to the Jetson world of in our own little bubbles flying around the network or in our cars. We still need to create a new type of public transport. It might have a bit more space, it might feel a little bit more less hectic and frenetic, but I don't think the world is going to change, which will make us feel we're in a recession in public transport. And more importantly, there's an opportunity to really utilise our rail network to benefit freight as well. But it will change, and I think personally, I don't know, everybody's saying that, and I'm sure people out there are saying that. It's a different space, and we're changing our timings, coming in later, thinking about our journeys. But we're a funny species, you know. We still love to be gregarious, get out there. Look what's happened in the pubs where you can actually go back to a semi-normal state. We're still going to be using public transport because one of the things about driving and using other forms is it's pretty restrictive when it comes to socialising. So it's a new state of normal, as they say.
It most definitely is. Howard, what about the regions? What do you see as, you know, there's obviously been a lot of talk about COVID stimulus. What do you believe government should be doing to stimulate growth in the regions? So the comment is that fast rail is an enabler, but what else can be done in terms of policy changes?
Yeah, and I think there's always a risk that fast rail is just seen as creating dormitory locations to feed a big CBD in like Sydney. My view is that there are, particularly in New South Wales, less so maybe in other states, some pretty whopping great centres of activity, which even if they stand alone or come together as a group, create a space in itself without even needing a single trip into in the metropolitan area of Sydney. And I think of Orange and Dubbo, you know, and Tamworth and, you know, a number of other of those areas. And I think also if you thought of Wagga and Albury and many of those other areas, they're pretty, Bathurst, they're pretty big cities in their own right. And I think there is an opportunity not just to provide more services into and out of Sydney and the Sydney-centric world, but how do we connect up people who want to go from Bathurst to Orange on a regular basis because there's a fantastic hospital there, or Mildura, you know, God forbid, in the post-COVID world between Broken Hill, because that's actually a better health experience than maybe people in Broken Hill. How do we do that? Well, we do that by looking at transport, and we do that looking at not only rail, but the connectivity that Pete Alloway has done with coaching services, not sticking to state, you know, blindness and thinking about where else do people want to travel. I think that's an important thing. And there will be, you know, there's always been this plan of sending people out from Sydney to establish, you know, Dubbo. All our licensing is done in Dubbo. But the weird thing was those people left those jobs in Sydney and went to Dubbo and filled those seats. Did they really create jobs for Dubbo? Or somewhere like Grafton, which where the licensing is done from? I'm not sure whether it really was the purpose it was created to, but we do need to think about this in the future and, you know, let people decide. There are fantastic, as Pete Alloway tells me all the time, the wonderful regional New South Wales. I'm sure the wonderful Victoria and Queensland is the same. There are many beautiful parts of regional and outer metropolitan state which will be the future for all of us. And hopefully we'll have a decent rail system connect us when we need to. And there's my advert for regional New South Wales.
Well done. Pete will be happy. And for those on the line that are not familiar, Pete Alloway is the CEO of New South Wales Trainlink, hence Howard's reference.
And now, not only Trainlink, he's my opposite number within regional outer metropolitan. So he talks about coaches and ferries and all things transport, just like I do.
Perfect. That real shift to multimodal and becoming mode agnostic, as you sort of mentioned. Now, I'm conscious of time. We've probably got time for one final quick question. We've had a comment come in from a gentleman saying, like you, he comes from the UK. He's been here now for 11 years. What's your plan, Howard? Will you stay in Australia or will you head back?
Well, now I'm partly Australian because I've got my citizenship, but I haven't done the ceremony, so that's been banned at the moment. So I claim I'm sort of a foot slightly in both camps. You know, I suppose I love the word a lucky country. And at the moment, I think we're a very lucky country and we've done exceptionally well. And from anyone who's involved in the transport industry, I would say just look at what's coming our way. Whether you're a young woman starting in their career and thinking about transport, or an old bugger like me, this is the place to be. There are always things which change, whether that's family, grandkids, all sorts of stuff, so I never say never. But I always say, I work in a place like Paris and London and Berlin, but within 5 minutes, I'm in Tahiti, Barbados, or Cronulla Beach. So why would I want to change? At the end of the day, I think we all got our reasons, but it's a great place to be. And I actually find this industry really exciting to be in Australia. And of course, let's not forget New Zealand, because that's as exciting as well.
Absolutely. And I mean, we're certainly very fortunate to have you in the industry here in Australia, and very fortunate to have you here with us today. As you mentioned at the start, you've got an incredible amount on your plate. So thank you for making the time, Howard, and for taking all the questions. We had a huge number that we didn't get to, so apologies to those people. I did try to cover as many as possible, but thank you to each of you for joining us today. We do have a forward plan of additional webinars that we will be running, so check out our website for where to register for those. And our next one is Wednesday next week, and we will be hearing direct from the Central Station Metro project, and we're planning to do a panel discussion around how they have constructed the Sydney Metro Underground whilst the Sydney network continues to run. So it should be quite a fascinating discussion around the Sydney Metro project there that's underway. Thank you to you, Howard. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Stay safe, everyone.
Stay safe. Bye.